Hello, everyone. Um, let's see here. Are we live? Yes, I think we are. Okay, awesome. Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Excited to see everyone and be here. If you do not know who I am Johnny and Elizabeth's son, and let's see, the husband of Justice. So Elizabeth's on vacation this week, and I'm taking over for today. Justice is going to be back with you guys tomorrow. So anyways, the theme of this month is government, as many of you know. A lot could be said on the government at the moment. Some of it good and some of it probably not so good. And I've been thinking a lot about what gives government the power that it has, and essentially what our response should be in the face of things that we don't agree with. So I'm going to kind of back into this discussion a little bit. We're going to do a little bit of a history lesson here. I think it's actually super fascinating stuff, though, and I'm excited to talk with you guys about it. I recently came across a Dennis Prager article, which, if you guys are not familiar with Dennis Prager, he's like a national syndicate Jewish, basically, radio host. So, he was talking about basically this idea that I'd never heard of before, which is that, he was saying that all Jews kind of have this like low-grade fear. And they constantly ask themselves the question, who of their friends would hide them if necessary? So like if there was like a Nazi takeover in America, who in their friend group would hide them? And I thought this was an interesting question, one that as a non-Jew, I'd certainly never asked myself. And I was curious at what his answer was going to be to this question. And so I think some of it will surprise you. Some of it maybe not so much. But, he said, another thing that I thought was interesting, and I agree with this, is that, this question of who would hide a Jew is actually kind of great importance. Many books have been written on the kinds of people that were behind the Nazis, how they were able to do this. How do you figure out how to like get so many people to go along with something so evil? And it's interesting because I think that's like less of an interesting question, even though we're going to kind of talk on that for a second, of like, why does that kind of evil exist? I think probably the answer is that level of evil is kind of the default nature of mankind. So, it's not so unusual that kind of evil exists. What's actually more interesting is like, how do good people rise in the face of that kind of evil? And so, I think another thing that's really interesting to point out, and there's nothing that existed in Germany 80 years ago that doesn't exist in America today. And I'm not talking about anti-Semitism. I'm actually talking about like there was something even beneath this core that I would say is kind of a default in all of humanity that we have to be really aware of in ourselves and in our basically in the countries that we live in. So, having a basic understanding of how these great tragedies can happen, I think, is a really important question of our day. So going back to what Dennis Prager was talking about, he was saying that the first kind of person who hid Jews during the Holocaust, it came of no surprise to me, but these would have been like your priests, your nuns, your Christians. It's worth saying that actually a lot of Christians did not hide Jews, but out of the group of people that did hide Jews, they were primarily Christians. A large majority, they were Christians. Now, this probably shouldn't surprise, or hopefully doesn't surprise anyone. But the second kind of person is the one I want to talk about a little bit more. I found the insight actually to be really novel and new. I'd never heard this before, but I thought it was really interesting. And he was saying that the second characteristic of the kind of person that would hide a Jew was not a faith-based trait, but it was actually a personality trait. And so he was saying that, and they did all these interviews on the kind of people that would hide Jews. So they actually have a really good understanding of who did this. But the people that were considered eccentric by society standards ended up being the kind of people that would hide Jews. And this is kind of interesting because it's like, why would that be? Why would people regarded as more eccentric be more likely to risk torture, death to hide a member of a group that they weren't part of. And the answer is, like, when you think about it, it's kind of obvious. It's that eccentric people are by definition people who march to the beat of their own drum, who are not, essentially they're nonconformists and they don't seek social approval. So, we see that one of the two, like, there were basically two qualities that were among people who were willing to go against the face of the Nazis and hide Jews. And that was, they either had some kind of faith-based reason for doing so, or they had a strong bent toward being nonconformists in society. So if we look at those two things, we can look at the other side of this. A parallel way of looking at this is, who were the kinds of people that were willing to kill Jews? And this is also fascinating for, its own reasons, I guess. If we see that faith and nonconformity are essentially people that don't seek social approval, were people that hid Jews, what was the characteristics of the Nazi soldiers? And it might actually surprise you to learn what that is. Again, this is something that much study and research and books have been written to, trying to discover the characteristics that would make up the kind of people that would do this. One of the main books in this field of study is a book called Ordinary Men. I recently just read this because I was curious just where it would go. It's called Ordinary Men because of how ordinary these men were that were a part of this specific unit. I guess they have all of the testimony and documentation on this one unit that had something like 500 soldiers in it. And they did this whole deep dive on how could you convert like this number of soldiers who were not like Nazi party members primarily. They were blacksmiths, they were laborers, they were farmers, they were people that really had no like underlining like anti-Semitic like bloodlust that you saw in so much of the leadership of the Nazi party. They weren't SS, they were like business owners and steelworkers and family people. And they were adults who had lived in pre-1933 Germany before these ideas became like kind of the undercurrent of what was happening. So this story backs into this group of like 500 men, and what's interesting about this group is that they were given essentially the task of killing like 2,000 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children right before like the final solution was put into place. So there were no gas chambers yet. And the Nazis were actually trying to figure out, would their soldiers at like point blank range go and kill unarmed children, women, and men? And so they used like this group of soldiers to kind of like prototype and test, could they get like their soldiers to like point blank kill these unarmed people? And so this story kind of backs into like how this happened, what this whole experience was like for them, and what's interesting is that the captain, on the day that they have to go do this, he says, we're about to have to do something that's horrible. I don't agree with it. And I want to give everyone the right to like, basically, essentially, I'm giving you a pass. If you don't want to take part in this, you don't have to do it. Out of the 500 soldiers, only 12 said that they would not do this, and up until this point, there had been no like innocent killing, like what they were about to do. And so it's interesting to me that out of 500 men, only 12 opted to not take part. That's pretty crazy. And they have all of this like in records and testimonies because these men were later found and they were tried and they have their testimony of why they did all this stuff, and by and large, the main answer that they gave was that it was easier for them to shoot than to stand up against the power structure, than to stand up against what the power structure in their army was telling them to do. So most of them felt that by breaking ranks, non-shooters were leaving essentially the dirty work to their comrades in arms. And since the battalion was going to shoot these guys, whether they did it or not, those who did not shoot risked essentially isolation and, refusing one's share of an unpleasant collective obligation. So there was this kind of like isolation, rejection, and prospect that they were afraid to live with. Essentially, they were afraid to not conform to what they were being told, so much so that they were willing to do something that they primarily said that they all disagreed with to do. And this is I feel like this is a very sobering thought. And many people just don't realize that most of the Nazi army was not like demonic, murderous, like super planned and premeditated murder that we see in like Hitler and those that were up in that level. Most of them were just people that had no like affiliation with this, but had been so caught up with this and just made the decision to conform to what was happening around them rather than stand up against it. So it's interesting because after this incident where these men killed these 2,000 women of unarmed Jewish women, children, and men, by the end of the war, this same unit had killed 35,000 people at gunpoint. So if you can imagine walking out to a field and having to look at your victim in the eyes and shooting them, doing this 35,000 times, and this unit was personally responsible for the deportation of 50,000 more Jewish people to extermination camps. So, they have this one moment in time where they're basically allowed to not take part in this evil. Only 12 of them do it. And by the end of it, this one experience takes them into being responsible for the death of 90,000 people almost. So, and we see that this was primarily the reason, this is what this novel says, is that that this conformity is why they do it. And so they did it because they were so afraid to not look like the rest of the group that they were in. And one of the things that happens right after conformity is this dehumanization of one another. And so we see that, when we conform into something that we don't agree with and that we can feel is wrong, it typically has a way of polarizing people that are not doing this, or polarizing us against whatever it is that's kind of conforming us into. And so, one of the things that seems to happen right after conformity is dehumanization. And so, the author Alex Kershaw famously said that, the road to Auschwitz was built by hatred, but it was paved with indifference, meaning that, the actual strategic, let's create something so mechanical and so systematic to try to destroy a whole race of people. It only took like maybe 0.5% or 1% of the population who thought at that level. And then they were able to do it because the rest of the 99% just said, hey, we're going to just go along with this, and we're going to just conform to this, even though in our heart of hearts, what we're doing is disgusting us and we might not agree with it. We're so afraid to not conform to it. So, it's interesting when you kind of read about how these great tragedies happen. So what does all this have to do with today? And I'm not comparing where we are at today to, by any means the Holocaust, but, I say all this to say that we are living in unprecedented times, and, by no means have we slipped into a place like Germany, but I think it's worth understanding how things like Germany have happened, and we are seeing what is, to me, herd-like behavior and unquestioning obedience to authority that I think few expected to witness in previously free countries, such as English-speaking ones that we live in. Worse, we've seen unquestioning authority and obedience to irrational authority. So I just think that we need to be very aware of where the path of conformity leads. And I would encourage all of you to do things in your daily life that makes you slightly uncomfortable. Another way of saying that is, how can we strengthen our nonconformity muscle? Because it's something that, is uncomfortable. We don't like to be outside of the group. We don't like to be outside of what feels familiar. We don't, taking a stand in small things is hard, but I think it's so necessary right now. It's necessary while we still have a lot of options to take a stand with. I'm reminded of Paul's exhortation in Romans 12 when he tells us to be not conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And obviously I know that he's talking specifically about sin in that area, but I think that when we go along with things that are not true, when we go along with falsehoods, when we go along with these things that are happening, that is something that I think erodes at the character of who we are. And so I think we need to be very aware of these things, So when we look at what does it mean to not conform to the world right now, I think the first thing we have to do is to not dehumanize the people that stand across from us. And I think that this is a huge thing, because I think that there is so much polarization and dehumanization in our culture right now. And I think one of the main efforts of the enemy is our dehumanization of one another. So we cannot fall into this trap. We have to continue to see the humanity in one another, and we have to fight for this. Whether you're masked, unmasked, vaxxed, unvaxxed, right or left, whatever it is, we have to see the humanity in one another and the God spark in one another, especially during this time when everything is trying to make our love go cold. So the first thing is to retain humanity in one another. The second thing we do is we just cannot conform to things that we do not believe are right. We have an obligation as believers who find our identity not in social groups, norms, or these peer pressures, but we find our identity in the kingdom of God. We have an obligation to stand up for truth wherever that is in our culture right now. This is a non-negotiable, and I'm telling you that now is the time to stand. Now is the time to show our courage. And if you feel afraid, it's time to ask the Lord to give you courage. Where can you take small steps? Where can you stand up? Now is the time to make ourselves uncomfortable for the stand that we're willing to take. And so, when I look at Jesus, I think, he is like one of the original nonconformists, and so much of his life was just not conforming to what was happening. And I think that is a great example for us. He did it, and he did it with so much love and humanization of people that were different than him. And so I think the task of our day is, how do we not conform in love, and do this in a way that doesn't allow us to be caught up in what's happening around us. So, in closing, there was a famous article that, a great novelist and philosopher, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, gave in Russia during one of the Marxist regimes that he lived in. This was during the 70s. And he wrote this article in the days leading up to what would eventually be the full development of the Marxist regime, when he was still allowed to write. And this article is what essentially got him expelled from Russia. And this article is called "Live Not by Lies." And I love even the name of that, "Live Not by Lies." I would encourage everyone to check this out and to read it in its fullness. I'm going to actually leave links for the book I mentioned and for this article below this these videos. So, I'm going to just read an excerpt from it, and then we're going to pray and close. But so this is kind of what he said, and this is what was happening in his day. He says, "We are approaching the brink. Already a universal spiritual demise is upon us, and a physical one is about to flare up and engulf us and our children, while we continue to smile sheepishly and babble. We have so hopelessly ceded our humanity that for the modest handouts of today, we are ready to surrender up all of our principles, our souls, and the prospects of our descendants, anything to avoid disrupting our meager existence. But here is the most accessible key to our liberation, and that is a personal non-participation in lies. Even if all is covered by lies, and even if all is under their rule, let us resist in the smallest way. Let us let their rule not hold through me. For when people renounce lies, lies simply cease to exist. Like parasites, they can only survive when attached to a person. So our way must be never knowingly support lies. Having understood where the lies begin, and many see this line differently, step back from this dangerous edge, and thus overcoming our audacity, let each man choose. Will he remain a willing servant of the lies, needless to say, not due to natural disposition, but in order to provide a living for the family, to rear his children in the spirit of lies? Or has the time come for him to stand straight as an honest man, worthy of the respect of his children and contemporaries? So that's kind of how that ends. And I say all that to just encourage you, that I just feel like now is the time where we are supposed to stand. I do not fear the murderous evil that controls most of the current power structures of the world, because I know that exists. And I think that to some degree that's always existed. What I fear most is the weakness and cowardly indifference of those around us, and just willingly going along with things that we know are not right. So I would encourage you all to stand and take courage, to exercise that nonconformist muscle, to not be afraid to feel what is the rejection sometimes and the temporary pain of having to go a different direction in our society. So in Deuteronomy 33, they end this whole chapter with Hazek, Hazek, Venech, Hazek, which in Hebrew is, in English, is just the be strong, and let us be strengthened. And so I just pray for courage and strength for all of you, and whatever you can do in your days right now, just that you would be nonconformist, that you would only conform to what is true, what is hopeful, what is righteous, what is honest, what the Lord is leading you to do, and just encourage you guys in this time. So the song of the day is a guy named Jervis Campbell. It's called "Hold Me Together." Like I said, the article, the news, or the article in the book that I mentioned will be in the links below. Justice is going to be with you tomorrow, and she's awesome and amazing. And so you guys are going to have a really great time with her. I think we're going to be back together on Friday. But anyways, blessings to you guys, and I hope you have a good day.